Hey guys, in this video, we're going to talk about blood pressure. When is it actually high? What does that actually mean? And what should we do about it? Right? So let's dive in. So, for a long time, what constituted high blood pressure was said to be when blood pressure got to 140 over 90 and stayed there consistently, which is very important. It has to be up there like elevated and staying there. However, in 2017, the level that constitutes high blood pressure was lowered from to 130 over 80. So now people who had a blood pressure of 130 over 80 consistently could be diagnosed with high blood pressure, whereas before it had to be 140 over 90. And when they lowered it like this, that made almost half of Americans eligible for pharmaceutical intervention. Now, it's interesting in that statement, in that decision, that 2017 decision to lower what constitutes high blood pressure, all of the not all of the authors, but lots of the authors and the reviewers of that reassessment of the guidelines had multiple ties to pharmaceutical companies. So we have to take that into account, right? Why are we pushing for the lowering of blood pressure? And why is the pharmaceutical companies funding that? Because now, if you lower it like that, half of people are eligible for the products that Big Pharma sells, which is a much higher amount than was before. Now, if half of America having high blood pressure, that either means that we're either incredibly unhealthy as a society, or the threshold for what medicine has decided constitutes high blood pressure is too low. And based on the fact that, studies have shown that only 6.8% of Americans have good cardiometabolic health, and current risk calculators for cardiovascular disease risk used by medicine have been shown to overestimate risk by 500%. It seems like it's a combination of both. We are unhealthy as a population, but also they're overestimating risk because they're putting these numbers, pushing them too low, in my opinion. So it's probably a combination of both. Now, let's look at some research here. So, one study found that in people age 75 or older, systolic blood pressure, which is the top number, below 130, and diastolic, which is the lower number, blood pressure below 80, increased risk of death 8 to 19%. So if these people who are 75 or older were being medicated to push their blood pressure lower than 130 over 80, that had increased risk of death by 8 to 19%, depending on who they looked at. Now, another study, a similar study, found that in people over 60 years old, systolic blood pressure under 120 increased risk of death, and a diastolic blood pressure under 80 made people 90 to 190% more likely to die, right? So they're medicating these people with who have high blood pressure. They're medicating their blood pressure to lower than 130 over 80 in that one study and 120 over 80 in this other study, and that made them more likely to die. It increased their all-cause mortality. And I would argue that's because as we age, especially as we age, we need enough perfusion pressure to deliver nutrients, oxygen, things to the tissues, to actually push that stuff into the tissues. And without enough pressure, that's not happening. People are getting sick and increasing their all-cause mortality. Now, the idea that lowering blood pressure decreases risk came from data in the famous Framingham study in Framingham, Massachusetts. But that data really only showed that blood pressure increased, or that risk increased if blood pressure was 70 to 80% higher than what's normal. So if normal is 120 over 80, that means that blood pressure really only increased risk if it was like 220, 210 over like 160 or 140 or something like that. And it stayed there consistently. Not that it got there and it was at there one point in time when they took it, but that it's constantly at that level. That's really the only time it increased the risk. Now, looking at that data, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute commented on that data and they said, well, it was thought-provoking, but after careful review of the study, they found that it does not offer a basis for changing the current hypertension guidelines, which to me doesn't really make sense. If you look at that data, which is like the longest ongoing study ever, they show that it's really only harmful if it gets that high. Then we shouldn't be medicating people that much for it. People with 140 over 90 or 160 over whatever, and so. However, this National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute is very funded by pharma, so it's not surprising. Now, there are four classes of or four kinds of blood pressure medications that are used mainly. There's diuretics, there's beta blockers, there's calcium channel blockers, and there's ACE inhibitors. And combinations, these drugs and combinations of these drugs have been linked to different things. They've been linked to dangerous electrolyte imbalances, so mineral imbalances. They've been linked to increased risk for diabetes. They've been linked to fluid retention, retaining fluid, or edema, having swelling. They've been linked to chronic cough, and they've been linked to increased risk of serious injury from falling after fainting, because there's not enough pressure to keep the blood going up into your head, and people stand up and they faint and they fall, and we get injuries from those. So they don't come without their complications, especially if we are over medicating people for them, and we're medicating people at too low of a number, right? And increasing their risk of these issues, but also, like we discussed in those previous studies, increased risk of all-cause mortality. Now, there's a few different studies that have also shown that treating mild high blood pressure, so there's a blood pressures in the 150 over whatever range, with medications actually made no real difference in rates of heart attacks or death rate from any cause, and that the harms from the side effects actually outweighed any potential benefit that they could have created, right? So again, we're over medicating people trying to meet this number, when in reality, the research is showing that medicating someone to meet that number is not helping and actually increasing risk for other things for people. So it's kind of some big issues. Now, one thing I do want to address here is that blood pressure is often linked to higher salt consumption, right? If we eat too much salt, it's going to increase our blood pressure, but there's really no evidence for that. So contrary to popular opinion, salt does not cause high blood pressure. So one study found that increasing salt intake up to 8 times what is said to be normal only resulted in mild blood pressure increases. So it really didn't make that much of a difference. Another study found that increasing salt intake downregulated mechanisms that increase blood pressure, right? So if we're getting adequate salt, it's actually downregulating those mechanisms that would increase the blood pressure. We're having more stable and normal blood pressures, right? And lastly, there was a review article on salt restriction and blood pressure found that drastic salt reduction only resulted in about a 1% drop in blood pressure. So again, adding the salt created a very mild increase, and decreasing the salt only resulted like a 1% drop in blood pressure. So, how much salt intake we have is not really relevant to blood pressure, I would say. However, I would say that the salt we should consume is more mineral salt, this mineral-based salt, not the processed salt or the preservative salt, that kind of thing. We should be having salt with a full array of all the essential minerals that we need. But don't be afraid of salt when it comes to blood pressure. There's no research to support that. Now, so what does really cause high blood pressure? I think it's one of two things, or both things. One is insulin resistance, when we're not getting insulin signaling. And then the other one, which I want to talk a little bit more about, is when we get poor stagnant blood flow, right? So research has shown that those with high blood pressure or elevated levels have an increased clumping of the elements of blood. They call this rouleau formation or agglutination. And this makes the blood more sludgy. So it's like sludge moving through a pipe rather than sliding through nicely, right? So we get this clumping up of stuff. And so it's hard for the blood to get through there. Now, when that happens, in order for the body to keep the blood moving in this sludge state, it has to increase the arterial pressure, kind of squeezes it down like that, causing this what they call vasorestriction of the blood vessel, and that causes the fluid to move faster through the blood vessel. But it has to create that restriction in order for it to move faster. So it's similar to like putting your thumb over the end of a water hose. You decrease the area of which the water can come out, and the water comes out faster. We can spray it faster. So the body does a similar thing when we get this sludgy blood, right? So then the question becomes, what's the cause of that sludgy blood? And to me, that is based on the research that I found, is that what causes that is when the body has not enough charge to it. So, I mean, there's many different kind of things that contribute to this lack of charge. But the main thing is a lack of infrared light exposure, which all life on this planet is supposed to be outside in infrared light all day long, because the sun is 40 to 50% infrared light, and we humans are living indoors. So infrared light is what builds structured water around the lining of the artery. And that structured water is what creates blood flow. And that structured water is also what creates a negative charge around the elements of blood, keeping them evenly spaced so they're not sticking up together, getting sludgy, so that the body has to restrict it. And so we get infrared light exposure to do that, but we do other things too: grounding, avoiding EMF, avoiding toxins, those types of things. And that creates a nice an environment for our blood to move adequately, so the blood vessels don't have to constrict so much, right? So, yeah, there's many things that can contribute to high blood pressure. Being metabolically unhealthy and insulin resistant is another one of them. But so getting metabolically healthy by setting circadian rhythm and eating a whole foods, lower carbohydrate diet was very important. But also things we can do to help charge that body is get infrared light exposure, avoid toxin exposure, avoid EMFs, and get direct contact with the earth, and those types of things. Now, another aspect of high blood pressure could be psychological stress. If we're living in a psychologically stressful environment, or we're always worried or anxious about something, that's increasing autonomic nervous system signaling to our body, and or imbalanced nervous system signaling to the body, which is then creating this more stress, vasoconstriction of the artery. So there's many different factors, but to me, that is how we should address high blood pressure. So if you like this video, please like it. Please subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on social media. And if you want to know more and you want more guidance or my coaching on how to actually deal with these issues, as well as all kinds of things like cholesterol, plaque, those types of things, I have a 12-week heart health mentorship program. So just click the link in the description of this video, and you can learn more about that program and potentially book a call with me. So hope you enjoyed it. Stay healthy out there.